Hello, everybody out there. With us once again is Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Wealth Management. And the topic this evening is whether Putin's move to demand payment of oil and gas supplies to Europe and other places in rubles rather than US dollars, whether that's actually going to threaten in the long run the US dollar's reserve status upon which our economy is largely dependent. So, Mark, good move by Putin, effective move, or just so much smoke?
I think it's a good move by Putin because one, it will boost up the value of the ruble, which has been hit dramatically here over the last several weeks with all the sanctions and everything. And then two, Russia is a very strong oil producing country. If you start buying oil in rubles, that would be another boost long term. It'd be a competitor against the US dollar.
Now, Putin already has current contracts with Europe. Those have to be completed first before he says this would apply to future contracts. So how soon will we see any effect on the economy with Putin demanding everything in rubles?
Well, it'll take some time. One, even though he's demanding rubles, from my understanding, the counterparties are still going to give him money in dollars. So he may not even get his rubles for that. And then as for the contracts are spread out over different companies. So you may have Exxon's its contract might be expiring in 3 years. Chevron might be expiring in 6 years. So it's going to be a very lengthy process scattered over years and different companies for all those contracts to expire and be reset.
In the meantime, he's still making money with the US dollar.
He's making a lot of money right now. The U.S. government, the money that's being spent on oil prices is basically funding 100% of his war in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and apparently, according to the statistics I'm reading, about 40% of oil is Russian oil going into Europe. So there's no way Europe is going to stop buying Russian oil because they're so dependent on it, and there's no alternative. Correct?
That's correct. There's no way they can stop, and that's why I'm kind of concerned when we get into the winter months. If Putin really wants to stick it to Europe because of all these sanctions, he can easily cut off the oil supply when it starts getting cold over there in October and really put a squeeze on them.
So, we've talked in the past about the dollar's reserve status, which really makes the US dollar strong and dominant in the world. Now, you were already saying before this move by Putin that there's other factors that could threaten that reserve status. What are those factors, first of all, and how much of an added factor now is Putin's move?
Well, there's actually been several attempts just here in the last few weeks. The Chinese have talked about creating an exchange to buy oil in the Chinese dollar, the yuan. There's been talk about moving to the euro as a competing currency against the dollar, but the U.S. government relies on that reserve currency status so much, they try their best to shoot holes, cut deals, and all that kind of stuff to make sure that it does not lose that reserve status.
Now, again, with Russia moving closer to China as an ally, can they combine their efforts and make the U.S. dollar even weaker if they have some kind of an effort where either it has to be rubles or it has to be a combination of rubles and the Chinese?
Correct. I believe the long-term strategy would be that. I think I mentioned, China's, the global banking system works on the SWIFT banking system, which, Russia right now is being excommunicated from that, except for oil trades. China has seen this problem for years and actually created what's called the SIP system, which is their equivalent to SWIFT inside China. And I do know that China has been talking to Russia here in the last 2 or 3 weeks to get them moved over to the SIP system.
Yeah. So all in all, then, the U.S. Move to prevent Russia from trading oil in other than U.S. dollars and the sanctions and all that, overall, it hasn't had a very detrimental effect on Putin.
No, not yet. But he's trying to fix that. I think the ruble thing was a pretty smart move by Putin.
Yeah. So who won here? Who won this round, Putin or Biden?
Well, we need to see how those payments are made, because even though he's demanding the payments be made in rubles, the contracts say dollars, And if I had to guess, he's probably going to get dollars wired to his account.
Yeah, and either way, he wins, correct?
Correct, because the oil prices go up, so they're paying him more and more dollars.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then when the current contracts run out, it's going to be rubles if Putin sticks with this. And then it weakens the dollar even more and strengthens Russia's economy even more, correct?
That's correct. And even if he doesn't get it paid in rubles, just with him saying that he wants it paid in rubles, guess what? The ruble jumped about 10% on that announcement.
Yeah. Uh, let's talk more about the value of the reserve status of U.S. Dollar currency. Why is that so crucial to our economy to have the dollar remain as the world's reserve currency? How does that work?
Well, it keeps a strong dollar. So in theory, a strong dollar is supposed to keep inflationary pressures low. Now, that's not currently happening. But another reason why you want as the reserve status is so that they can keep buying U.S. bonds. The reserve currency basically finances the deficits on the additional spending that the government does with having to borrow money every year. So that's also beneficial from it. And then also by having it as the reserve currency, knowing that you're always going to have that demand, it makes it much easier for the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air because they know that central banks around the world have to keep it on hand. So they know there's always a buyer for it.
Basic definition of reserve currency. What does that mean?
That means that is a currency that every central bank has to keep in their vaults for whatever reason.
Globally.
Globally. So every bank, so anyway, oil can only be bought in US dollars. So that means every country in the world that uses dollars, their government has to hold US dollars to be able to purchase that oil.
So that's just about every country in the world that uses oil or gas, correct?
That is every country in the world.
Yeah. So, uh, if we reserve that reserve status, then how much of an effect, detrimental effect, will that have on the U.S. economy?
I don't think it'll have an effect in the short term, but longer term, what you'll eventually see is people will start selling their dollars to replace it with euros, rubles, or whatever, and that will drive the dollar down. And driving the dollar down should have an inflationary effect. Think this way: if right now you can buy let's say a Russian widget for $1 and the dollar goes down, it may now cost you $2 to buy that same Russian widget. So a declining dollar automatically causes inflation due to the currency conversions.
And how soon might this happen?
For years, I've kind of been a dollar bear, just simply because I don't think you can have a strong currency when you're printing trillions of dollars of money every year and you're running up these massive amounts of deficits. I've been a dollar bear for like the last 2 or 3 years, but the United States keeps pulling it out of thin air on keeping the dollar as the reserve currency, and they keep pushing it higher and higher. So until then, I think it could be a while. Not to mention, with the Federal Reserve's raising interest rates, in investment theory under what's called Fisher theory, higher interest rates actually causes your currency to become even more valuable. I'll give you a case in point. In the United States, you can buy a 10-year Treasury bond for a 2.3% dividend, for a 2.3% interest rate on it.
Right.
Go to Europe and try to buy an exact same 10-year bond issued by like the German or French government, and you're basically getting maybe 0.1%, and in some cases negative yields on those bonds.
Yeah. So again, are we seeing now more of a precarious position of the dollar and the U.S. economy, not immediately, but somewhere down the line? And is this unprecedented?
I wouldn't say it's unprecedented. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. government has always tried different ways to make the dollar go up. They've always tried ways to make sure they can eliminate on making the dollar go down. Case in point, during the Great Depression, when we were on the gold standard, the value of gold was going up, which automatically pushed the U.S. dollar up. Well, but they couldn't print more money because if you had printed $1 worth of $1, you had to have $1 worth of gold. They took it off the gold standard, which allowed them to print unlimited amounts of currency.
That's another thing, off the gold standard. So What backs up the dollar now?
Basically a promise.
It's all just thin air, right? Whatever they say they
It's a
could back up.
it's a
I mean,
promise. Yeah, it's a promise.
in other words, there is no gold or any other tangible substance that backs the dollar.
It's just a promise. It's just words. That's all it is. Words.
So why does that still work?
That beats the living daylights out of me. Maybe because it's the reserve currency. Another thing that just throwing this out there, on the gold standard, the U.S. Constitution specifically requires the official currency of the United States to actually be coined, not paper.
That's right. But all right, again, if everybody knows that there's nothing that backs up the U.S. dollar, there's nothing you could say, I've got $10,000 here in paper currency. I want to redeem it for gold or something of value that equals the same value. What would they give you?
Well, it's there's nothing. It's kind of like this. I think of it this way, Larry. If I have gasoline and you want to put gasoline in your car, and I say you got to bring me a rock, you need to go out and find a rock someplace, a nice shiny rock, and give it to me. As long as if I'm requiring you to pay me in rocks, you're going to make sure you have a lot of shiny rocks on hand.
But since we don't have any shiny rocks or gold on hand, why does everybody go along with this? I mean, why is everybody ignoring the fact that there is nothing backing the US dollar?
That goes back to it being the reserve standard, is because the demand for oil, since all dollars have to be traded in oil, as long as we drive cars, there's a demand for dollars, and that demand for dollars, just like, Bitcoin, Bitcoin's nothing, but there's a demand for it. As long as there's a demand for it, it has a value.
All right, now also, last question. How long can we service our debt, which is enormous and increasing by leaps and bounds every second? I mean, how long can this continue?
I think probably critical mass will probably be here towards the end of the decade. By my calculations, kind of like just run through quick math, like right now the government brings in about $3.5 trillion in tax revenue, but they spend $4.5 trillion every year, meaning they have to borrow an additional $1 trillion to finance the government. Of that $4.5 trillion, 66% of that goes to Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments on our debt. So by the end of this decade, the $3.5 trillion that we actually bring in tax revenue, by my estimates, 110% will go just to those three things. So they will have to go out and borrow additional money just to meet those three line items. And we haven't even talked about, so you're going to have to go out and borrow roughly $3.7 trillion by my estimates just to pay those three things. And now you're going to have to go out and borrow an additional $3 to $4 trillion just to pay government salaries and the defense. Come 2028, the interest payments on that the U.S. pays every year on its debt will be in excess of $1 trillion in interest. And to give you an idea about what 1 trillion is, before you answer the question, how long a trillion seconds is, do you know what was happening 1 billion minutes ago? 1 billion minutes ago.
What?
1 billion minutes ago, the Roman Empire was actually invading Great Britain. 1 trillion seconds ago, cavemen were painting on cave walls. 1 trillion seconds is almost 30,000 years.
Wow. That gives some perspective on what these sums actually are.
And we currently have $32 trillion in debt, and the interest payments on that $32 trillion in debt is over $300 billion per year.
Again, Mark, how long will this continue? I mean, are we going to reach a point where we just can't service the debt and everything falls apart, or will the game continue? You just pretend that it's there, that you could service the debt, and everything continues as normal.
Well, okay, I will say this is one of the benefits that the U.S. government has that no other country in the world does have. The U.S. debt, that $30 trillion that we have, 100% of that is based in U.S. dollars. So 100% of U.S. liabilities are based in U.S. dollars. The advantage to that is, if you really wanted to, the U.S. government could basically turn on the printing presses, print, 30, $40 trillion and be debt free. No other country in the world can do that. So like, let's say Italy. Italy has debts in euros. It has debts in dollars, pounds, yen. Italy cannot go out and print $1 trillion worth of yen or $1 trillion worth of dollars and pay off its debt. The United States is the only country in the world, 100% of its liabilities are based in its home currency.
All right. So therefore, as long as we can keep the printing presses going, it doesn't matter how big the debt is, because everybody goes along with the construct that it's pretend money, but the pretend money is the reality, and it works.
Correct. And to go one step further, that's what the reserve currency actually helps the US dollar, because when you have those dollars on hand, you just don't have dollars in cash on hand. That all that debt that the United States is printing, that reserve currency, that's what that reserve currency is actually sitting in. Does that make better sense?
Well,
So you automatically have demand for dollars and debt.
right. And people buy the debt and make profits in dollars. So it's all one like perpetual motion machine.
It's one big scam.
But it works.
It works for now.
Well, I mean,
worked.
it sounds like it could work indefinitely, because as long as you keep the scam going in this circle, everybody's happy, everybody gets paid, even though there's nothing backing it. So what's to stop it? It can go on ad infinitum, can it not?
That's the thing. U.S. loses that reserve currency status. You won't have as much demand for dollars, and you won't have as much demand for debt. Remember, by my estimates here, about another 10 years, we're going to have to print, basically, we're going to be printing close to $3 or $4 trillion a year in new debt. If we're not the reserve currency in 10 years from now, who's going to buy that $3 trillion worth of new debt?
Okay, so that's what's going to break the bank, is if we lose the reserve currency status.
I mean, there could be other things, but if I had to label one thing, I think the reserve status is up there as my number one item that would basically set the ball in motion.
Okay, so what is the chance that that will actually happen? How likely is that?
I don't know. I'm going to throw a rumor out here at you. I've heard this rumor. I can't validate it, but it makes a lot of sense. Back here in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it had been very heavily rumored that Iraq was actually developing a new exchange to actually buy and sell oil in foreign currencies, and the dollar was not supposed to be part of that exchange.
Yeah.
I find it kind of interesting that when it was scheduled to go live to be able to buy oil in euros or yen and all that kind of stuff, the United States invaded Iraq. I just find that very odd.
Yeah, I've read that over the years too, that was one of the reasons why we took Iraq and Saddam Hussein down. He was going off the financial reservation. So again, the crucial element here is the reserve status of the U.S. dollar. And if we lose that, everything goes down. Or can it be pulled out some other way?
I mean, the government's been very creative in how they've done things over the years with finance and stuff. They might be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat, but as of right now, I don't know how they could do that. If you lose your reserve status, you've automatically put a huge dent in the demand for a very debt-ridden country.
And how soon do you think we might lose reserve status?
If you'd asked me this question like a month ago, I said, hey, it's probably years and years away, because of this Ukraine thing and how China's seeing how the United States is treating Russia and how Russia's basically getting punched. I think if there's any plans to try to get for foreign countries to find an alternative to reserve currency, I think this Ukraine thing has definitely sped it up. There's a lot more talk going on in Russia and China on how can we basically get out from under the thumb of the United States and the SWIFT system and the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency.
And again, with Putin's move this week to demand rubles in payment for future contracts with Europe and anybody else, that's the beginning of the assault on the reserve status of the US dollar.
Correct. And if you can remove the reserve status, that's basically a great way to get revenge. Just basically a sanction now on the United States because you have given your other countries an alternative on where they can go to buy and trade oil in.
Wow. Stay tuned, folks. We'll give an update on this as soon as other developments become apparent. Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Wealth Management, thanks very much for being with us, I think, once again, with more dire predictions. So we'll see what happens. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.